समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
This is that juncture in geopolitics where everything looks so much in turmoil that people are searching for famous quotes from the past, from great men of the past, great people of the past that might describe the times of today. So one name you will find popping up all the time is Thucydides. Thucydides was a 5th century BC Greek historian / general, and he wrote a famous book on the Peloponnesian War. We'll talk about that as we go along after a little bit. So what did Thucydides say? He said multiple things. In fact, if you go to Goodreads or something like that and fetch out his quotes, you will find lots of them, and many of those are available on old parchments and things. Now, he said most famously, and that's where we begin this episode of Karta Clutter, because we are talking about how the new American strategic worldview might develop or is developing under Donald Trump. And in this case, this particularly refers to China, Taiwan, and US military power. So stay with me. So what is it? What is it that Thucydides says? First of all, he says the strong do what they have to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Right? That is what you see coming out in so much of Donald Trump's language. He tells Zelensky, you accept ceasefire on these terms, sign away your critical minerals to me, etc., etc. So the strong, that is Donald Trump, the US, they do what they have to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. That is something that the Europeans now have decided that they will not accept, and that's why they're coming together, and that's the reason France is offering them their nuclear umbrella. That's one. That's one. So Thucydides, the strong do what they have to do, and the weak accept what they have to accept. Now we can't just leave it at Thucydides. What is it that Lenin said? Because all great people must have said something to describe the times of today. So Lenin said there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. How many weeks has it been since Trump came to power? We are still into his 7th or 8th week right now, and see how much has changed. This is like history of 8 decades has been turned inside out. So Lenin, there are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks when decades happen. And we can't quote all these great people and forget our own Kautilya. And what did Kautilya say? He said, no means is beyond the scope of the ruler in order for him to expand the territory, gain power, and wealth of his nation. Right? So all three said these very important things which apply to today's times. Now, all of this is playing out in today's geopolitical developments and debate. Now, there are lots of things happening, and good thing is that all good or interesting thing is, or maybe disturbing thing, that a lot of the geopolitics is now being played out in the open. In the past, most diplomacy was done discreetly. Now, a lot of it is done on TV. Donald Trump said the other day after his dust up with Zelensky, he said to the cameras, this is good TV, isn't it? Right? In this era, the other thing that we look at is something that was always available, but we did not pay so much attention to it unless it was a testimony to do with our region, what the Americans call South Asia, what I might call the Indian subcontinent. However, now everybody is looking at what this new administration will do with the world, and that's why the testimony at the House Armed Forces Committee by somebody who might normally would have been seen, whose appointment might have been seen as not such a key one, because this is not the Secretary of Defense. This is the Undersecretary of Defense. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Undersecretary in the American system is like our Minister of State, right? But this testimony has become very newsy. It's being talked about. You see Japanese press, Taiwanese press, Chinese press, American press, Wall Street Journal has multiple articles because Elbridge Colby, who's Trump's nominee for Undersecretary of Defense for policy and multiple other things, but under the larger umbrella of policy, he is somebody who's focused on Asia for a long time. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Pentagon between 2017 and 18, again when Trump was president, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. I presume his tenure would have coincided with General Mattis's, and his exact role as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense was for strategic affairs, force development, strategic analysis for policy planning, and he was the Pentagon's main man in drafting the Defense Department report of 2017 and the National Defense Strategy of 2018, right? So he's a key figure. However, for many years now, he's been writing that the Americans are focusing too much on Europe and too much on the Middle East, that America, instead of looking at multiple wars, they have to look at one war, winning one war or 1.5 war. That was also the essence of the 2018 Pentagon document that laid out the new strategy, that don't think of fighting multiple wars and winning them. They deplete your energy, they dissipate your power at that point and make you incapable of winning even one convincingly. So how do you do it? You try and limit your attention only to the possibility of one war by creating conditions so you can avoid the other wars. Either you can create conditions to avoid the other wars through diplomacy, or you can outsource the other wars to those who it affects more. So Europeans should take care of their own defense. That means they should take care of Russia. The Middle Eastern power should take care of their own defense. That is the Gulf states and Israel, etc. America can help them, but don't be always thinking of being there to help everybody physically. And this comes to Iran as well. Now, this is something that's been controversial. Particularly, the pro-Israeli lobby has not liked him. They say that he's somebody who now thinks that even if Iranians get a nuclear weapon, it is not such a humongous threat to America. America can contain Iran even if Iran gets a nuclear weapon. That's why his views are controversial, but his views are important. And that's also the reason Trump has chosen him in this position, because he's been tweeting ever since the war in Ukraine started. He's been tweeting, he's been writing. 2024, he wrote one more article in the Wall Street Journal. He's been writing and saying that you are expanding too much of your limited power in Europe. Keep your powder dry because you will have to deal with China next and you are underprepared. So he had a 2.5-hour testimony at the House Armed Forces Committee, of which I'm sharing some parts with you and some of the things he said, because these are very interesting. And certainly, he's no dissident in the Trump administration. He's in fact a favorite, at least stated to be so by Pete Hegseth, the new Secretary of Defense, who is packing the Defense Department now with American isolationists. If I look at the American debate right now in the media, think tanks, elsewhere, there are two kinds of Republicans right now in the Trump era. One who believe in peace through strength, right? Peace through strength, that means don't take pangas either with us or with any of our friends, or we will be there with the sledgehammer and sort you out. The second is retreat from the world. That retreat from the world is the category of people that Pete Hegseth is filling the Pentagon with right now. So it looks like Trump's approach is going to be a retreat from the world. And if the world comes to us, we'll deal with them, because you know what he said? We've got these two beautiful oceans. Now, if you see Colby's appointment in that context, see what he's been saying. He's been saying that America should become Asia focused, and he's long been saying that America should conserve its resources, focus on China and Taiwan, not on Europe. And how does it go on? He says, and there is an excellent summary. I will share a link of the entire testimony with you, but there is an excellent summary on Nikkei by Ken Moriyasu. So thank you, Ken Moriyasu. Now, Colby says there that the Taipei spends too little on its defense, too little, which is about 2.45%. Taipei's GDP is about 814 billion, a little less than $1 trillion, but remember, it has a population only of 2.3 crore. So a very tiny population, less population than all of Delhi, but a GDP of 814 billion. Colby says Taiwan, since it lives in such a dangerous neighborhood and China covets it, wants to take it over anytime, carries out these threatening drills and all that, I'm adding all of that. It can't afford to spend only 2.5% of its GDP on defense when we in America spend 3.4% of our humongous GDP on defense. So Taiwan has to spend more instead of just counting on America. And he worries, and this is what is said in his 2024 article also, and in this testimony also, that he finds it very worrying. And in fact, he's irritated that Taiwan is taking its security for granted with the presumption that the Americans will come to our defense. So he's saying Taiwanese have to take charge of their own defense, and they have to take their defense spending up to 10% of their GDP. Why 10% of GDP? Because he says, look, all I'm trying to do is to incentivize Taiwan to enhance their own security, their own defense, to avoid, and I'm quoting now, to avoid precipitating a conflict that is not necessary with Beijing, and to secure enough time for the US to rebuild its defense industrial base. So what's his argument? His argument is that America's defense industrial base has weakened. American military has weakened. America today cannot afford to fight China. Forget fighting multiple wars with China, Russia, and also in the Middle East. So America needs time. And that time for America vis-a-vis the Chinese has to also be bought by the Taiwanese by enhancing their own spending on defense. Similarly, he goes on to give somewhat identical sermon to the Japanese as well, but we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. He was questioned by Senator Tom Cotton, who's a Republican from Arkansas and a prominent senator. And he said, why have you shifted your position? In 2016, you were saying that America should give explicit guarantees. Colby is a think tanker, a scholar, and also very much in public debate. He's also a columnist. So Senator Tom Cotton asked, why have you shifted your position? In 2016, you said America should give explicit security guarantees to Taiwan. Abhi kya ho gaya? What has changed now that you are saying that island, that is Taiwan, is no longer an existential interest to the US? Colby says, and mark these words, because there's been dramatic deterioration, this is in quotes, dramatic deterioration of military balance with China. And he says, and I quote, I have always said that Taiwan is very important to the United States, but as you said, that is, he's addressing Cotton, but as you said, it's not an existential threat. What is America's core interest according to him then? Core interest or where America has existential interests? He says the core interest is in denying China regional hegemony. And that can't just be done by sending American power there. China's neighbors have to take that responsibility. That's where he wants Taiwan to take its defense budget up to 10% of its GDP. If you just make a basic calculation, 10% of Taiwan's GDP would take its defense budget to a little bit higher than India's defense budget now. And India is a country of 143 crore people. Taiwan is a country of 2.3 crore people. That's a lot of spending. Then Colby says, and I quote, losing Taiwan's fall would be a disaster for American interests. He acknowledges that. And then says, but the US military balance with China in the region has declined so drastically that a conflict with China risks decimating the US military. And then he goes on to quote from history of the Second World War, when then Royal Air Force Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, he resisted Churchill's pressure to send his fighter planes, Spitfires and Hurricanes to participate in the Battle of France, to defend France against the German invasion, because he said this will weaken Royal Air Force when time comes for the defense of Britain. And he says, he compares America's situation vis-a-vis China to that right now, that this is not the time for us to go and do saber rattling on behalf of Taiwan in that region. He says, my fear is that US is not prepared for a conflict with China. And I quote again, and these are very important quotes, it is vital for us to focus and enable our own forces for an effective and reasonable defense of Taiwan, and for the Taiwanese as well as the Japanese to do more. There is a risk of major war, he says, and we cannot afford to lose one. I recognize the realities in my bone. It is my great hope that we get through the coming years peacefully with strength in ways that put us and our alliances on a stronger and more sustainable footing. In his written response to the committee, he also said that Japan must at least spend 3% of its GDP on defense. Today, it's about a half of that, to which immediately there was a response from the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, who said the Japanese will decide how much we spend on defense. No one else will tell us. And he says Colby says Japan should spend at least 3%, revamp its military on a denial defense of its own archipelago and collective defense in its region. So once again, he's putting this responsibility on the Japanese as well. After that, Trump also had this outburst on camera where he said, we guarantee Japanese defense. What do the Japanese do for us? Right? These treaties, what do these matter? To which people are pointing out that the Article 5 in the NATO treaty, the only time it's actually been invoked is after 9/11. After 9/11, when Americans had it invoked, right? So all NATO members became part of America's campaign against the perpetrators of 9/11 in America's global war of terror. It became global because all of NATO joined and Article 5 was invoked. Trump, however, is attacking Japan and saying, we guarantee their security. Do they also guarantee our security? You can see that Colby is probably saying the same thing, but in an academic's language. So he says that America should press Tokyo, and I quote, in a constructive but pressing fashion. Generally, he says, America should prioritize China over Europe and the Middle East. This has got the pro-Israeli groups upset because they think that this sounds soft on Iran when Trump himself has used very strong language on Iran. However, Colby represents a view in the new Pentagon that believes in realistically protecting and advancing American security, freedom, and prosperity. So another questioner for him was Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island, who said that, look, the fact that we are dumping Ukraine right now, that displays a certain fecklessness, that is irresponsibility, casual weakness on the part of the Americans. How can you trust these Americans? To which Colby's reply is that, no, it isn't just that. This is prioritization. So Colby is seen in the American system as a prioritizer, that many things demand your attention, but what is it that deserves it most of all? So he says there should be focus, and I quote, focus to revitalize American defense base to a level that it can resource in multiple threats at the level that we need. That's what we want to get back to. And once again, his point is that the American defense industrial complex, American military capability has weakened so much. It's become so run down that forget a multi-front war. Forget fighting two wars at a time. Today, it's inadequate even to fight a war with the Chinese and win. In fact, he says his great concern is that we will not win that war and we cannot afford that. How do we then sum up what he's saying? What he's saying is that Europe, division of labor, let Europe build itself to deal with Russia. That's not an immediate threat to us. Let powers in the Middle East build themselves to deal with their own threats. That's not of immediate concern to us. We can help them but not be there. Don't offer your intervention. China is a threat that we can't lock horns with right now because we are not good enough. We are not strong enough. That's why buy time until you can become strong enough. However, he also does not go into whether a confrontation with China is inevitable. He does not say that, but the hint is there, because if there is one thing on which there is unanimity even in this broken American system right now, which has bipartisan acceptance, it is that China is the real big threat for tomorrow, and China has become much too powerful right now to be dismissed lightly. China is much too close to America in overall strength. It's got a lot more stability, consistency in its policy. It's spending a lot on defense. Just this Thursday, China came up with its fresh budget where they've shown a 7.2% increase. Their budget is about 1.7% of their GDP, which remember is about five and a half times of India's GDP. So you can see how much they spend on defense. I will also give the figures also in a minute. US is $895 billion. China is $267 billion. India, for comparison, is $75 billion, Russia 126, UK 71.5, France 55, Japan 57, and Taiwan $20 billion. In fact, if Taiwan takes its defense spending up to 10% of its GDP, Taiwan's defense spending will become about 20% more than all of India's defense spending. That said, what is this thing about inevitability of a confrontation with China? Nobody uses that word inevitability, but that is the subtext of everything. That brings back Thucydides in our lives. I started with Thucydides and I said we'll come back to it. So the other thing that Thucydides did not exactly say, but which was interpreted from his writings, particularly from his book, History of Peloponnesian War of 431 BC, American political scientist Graham T. Allison sees picture. He deduced a line from it. And that was published in a 2012 article for Financial Times. And then he wrote a book about this also. That line is basically that war becomes the likely outcome when one emerging power threatens to displace an existing great power as a regional or global hegemon. So we have this global hegemon, global power, unchallenged, unipolar world, and then somebody starts rising and gets closer and closer, and this one begins to get insecure, ki mere raste mein aa raha hai, and then war becomes likely. Doesn't say inevitable, likely. After this, Graham T. Allison also headed a group at Belfer Center at Harvard University, which did some wargaming and some study of the history. Starting the 15th century, they found that of the 16 such situations when an emerging power threatened an existing big power, 12 out of 16 it led to a war. This understanding is that Peloponnesian War of 431 BC started when Sparta was the reigning big power and Athens was rising. And at one point, the Spartans got so concerned with the rise of Athens that they will now be challenging us and deposing us from the top spot that the war took place. And that is what Allison drew that logic from. That at one point, when one emerging power begins to inch close to the status of a reigning superpower, then war becomes inevitable or most likely. That is the Thucydides trap. And can you get out of Thucydides trap? It is possible to get out of it through diplomacy, etc., but takes a lot of hard work. However, in the American debate, other people also think, like Joseph Nye Jr., who's also an intellectual of tremendous weight, he thinks that Allison misread the cause of that Peloponnesian War. Now that theory has had much criticism, as you would expect. It has caused much debate in the American system. But if I look at the list of those 16 situations, of which 12 led to a war, only 2 of those 16 involve an Asian nation. China once, Japan once.